I'm really excited to be here today with Kyle R. McNease, who I met on Twitter, which is actually a great place to meet people as long as you keep your timeline trimmed down to the good folks. So Kyle posted a thread on Twitter a while back that really caught my eye, and he was talking about something that came up in one of Paul VanderKlay's analyses of a discussion. And so I want to riff off of that thread. We're just going to take it apart bit by bit. And so the three main things that stuck out to me were the nature of attention, the nature of psychotechnologies, and the nature of worship. So we're going to talk about that. And we could start with, along the way, I'm expecting we'll hear a little bit about Kyle's life, because Kyle has a very, very interesting and difficult history. But he's already talked about that on Paul VanderKlay's show. So I'm going to have a link to that for those who want to pursue it more. But for this, I thought we would just get started talking and then see what comes up. So first of all, in this thread, Kyle makes this comment that there's so much that can and should be said from a communication perspective. But let me just say that one of the surprising elements about the gospel is that God puts the onus on himself to draw all men to him. This is vital because it reveals something about our human condition. So you went on to say, and this is what I thought was really interesting. Jesus comes along and says, Paul VanderKlay doesn't have to be interesting to lead people to me. He just needs to lift me up and I will draw them. So you were listening to Paul, and something that Paul said in his analysis kind of caught your attention. So what was it?
Yeah, and so first, let me just, again, thank you. Huge fan, and really appreciate the fact that you're focused on meaning. I think that that's probably one of the areas where failing to dive into that and address a meaning crisis that was probably about as evident as the iceberg the Titanic was headed towards. It's been a huge failure, and I think that's writ large. It isn't just one institution or organization. I think that the West itself sort of abandoned what that meant to pursue meaning and to pursue light. And in so doing, we've done ourselves, our civilization, a great deal of harm. And so I appreciate anyone who's focused on that. And so I really do thank you for your work and for being willing to just dive into these topics. So thank you so much for allowing me to take up some of your time. So my relationship with Paul goes back, I don't know, it's been several years now. I think so. It was 2 or 3 years. 2018, I think. So what was fascinating to me is I was coming at this from a completely different perspective than him. He was sort of interested in Jordan Peterson as it relates to the church. I was actually in 2015, 2016, working on a grant project focusing on death and meaning. And so one of the individuals who had done a lot of work in the space was Jordan Peterson. And so he has 120, maybe more than that, just scholarly publications. And so as little known as he was outside of academia, it wasn't like he was an unknown entity within academia. But then many of us sort of sat back and like, whoa, what's happening here? So I thought it was interesting that there was just this point of intersection where Paul saw it from, hey, the church should be paying attention to this guy. He's doing something that we're not. He's filling crowded venues to talk about Genesis for 3 hours. And we're lucky if we can get 3 people to come for an hour. So I was just listening to his commentary and have kept up with it over the years, because I think he's done a great job of trying to embody what it is that we claim we're supposed to be doing as Christians. So in one episode, he may be talking about psychotechnologies, but the next minute he may be talking about the new challenge of a homeless person right outside his door. And so I think that's one thing that keeps me coming back to his commentary. And so big shout out to Paul. And he's actually how I learned of your channel as well. And so a lot of wonderful spaces opening up for dialogue through the community that he's helping build and support. There's been a lot said about attention, worship, psychotechnologies, and I think I push back in certain ways because I think we can go too far and misread what the science is saying and sort of get on board and do something similar to a God of the gaps, where we're looking to science to kind of justify or explain what's going on. But if you know anything about science, and yes, it accretes and it goes along this process, but it's not linear and it's never final. So even as we're searching for a kind of theory of everything, and I know you've done a lot of work on Wolfram and now Dr. Levin as well. And I feel like there's a lot of convergence in their work as they're sort of searching for a computational answer for things. But it's almost as if the church, not realizing that we've become quasi-materialists, if not full-blown materialists ourselves, we latch onto this like a psychotechnology. Oh, okay, so perhaps you can get to God through a psychedelic experience. Then we make this logical leap and say all routes to God are possible through a psychotechnology like psilocybin. And the thing is, I have no problem with psilocybin. I think the work there is pretty remarkable. If you look at cancer patients and end of life and the kind of perspective changes that you see, what it draws our attention to. But I think we go too far when we start to talk about worship and how just like the music itself is a psychotechnology that if you get it just right, that you can sort of enter this realm where you experience the divine. I think one of the reasons why I say that is, first of all, C.S. Lewis cleverly pointed out that he would pray when we go out in nature and have these experiences with God. And he began to sort of tightly correlate and associate being out in nature with experiencing the presence of God. And so then it becomes a bit of a formula. If I go out into nature, then I will experience God, rather than seeking God. And so you can't ever enter Narnia the same way twice. And so the idea that there's this easy formula, or perhaps no one used that qualifier, easy, because I don't think it's easy to necessarily lead worship.
I think easy is very important there, because I think there is something about the sacred traditions of the church that are not easy, that also have that, can have that impact, and that coincidentally lined up with the science as well. So there's this weird thing, I'm always listening to all kinds of stuff, and so my brain is many directions. But this morning I was listening to Andrew Huberman talk about sugar's impact on the brain, because I was off sugar for almost 4 years and it was so great. And then just recently I let myself just a little bit, and it has this tremendous draw in me. I don't know what it is, but anyway, so I'm listening to this video of him, And he started talking about the visual cortex and how the neurons in the brain are actually, there are, trillions of neurons. I don't know how many, but there are specific neurons that are dedicated to seeing vertical lines and horizontal lines and lines that are somewhere in between vertical and horizontal. And that's how we see. When we see something, all these different neurons are each detecting their orientation, and all those orientations come together in the lines that we perceive, and then we see a face, or we see a tree, or something. This is how the visual neurons work. Interestingly, when we have a good balance of glucose in our bodies, the neuron that is dedicated to the vertical perspective, the vertical line, it will detect things that are slightly off of vertical. And if our balance of glucose is precise, then it will have a little bit of flexibility in there. But if we don't have enough glucose, if we get into a fasting state, it is absolutely, no, I'm sorry. If you have the right kind of glucose, it's very precise. If you have enough glucose, it's very precise. And it will only see these perfect lines. But if you are in a fasting state, there's a lot more flexibility into what can be seen in these lines.
Interesting.
And as he was talking, it sort of came into my mind like, oh my gosh, that's why fasting is so valuable, because it allows us to begin to perceive something that is not in our visual frame. It allows us to have a different frame in the way that we see. Maybe later on I'll find the clip and play it for you, but that just blew my mind, because if you get sugar, it activates you to see things precisely exactly the way they are out in front of you. But if you're in a fasting state and you don't have enough, then the world begins to look more flexible, like there's a spiritual reality out there that you can't see when you're all amped up on sugar.
This is, the more that we learn, I think that the clearer it becomes that there is something missing about the condition that we find ourselves in. And one of the things is that in necessity, that sort of draws you out into the world and sharpens your attention. I know several years ago now, I'm always fidgeting with things, like you said, just slight perturbations in lactate, glucose, ketones, whatever fuel source you're using. It switching and seeing, how does that affect my body? Not kidding. I went on this raw vegan diet, just like I didn't. It was like going out to an athletic competition without stretching at all. I was just like, oh yeah, I'm going to do it. And so just 100% raw vegan. And for the first few weeks, the acuity, like the senses, everything. And then over time, what happened was I started noticing I was craving meat so bad, protein. And I told my wife, I think one of the things that's happening is like my body is one of the reasons why it's becoming so receptive to all these cues from my environment that I wasn't picking up before. Like it recognizes it's in a state of deprivation. That's not true for everyone, but for me and the kind of life I was living at the time, I just wasn't getting enough calories to sustain me. And so that's exactly what my dietitian said. He was like, look, you gotta change it up. It's just not working for you. Everybody's different. You got to find what works for you. And so it really was this awareness that, wait a minute, these different states of consciousness, if you think about attention, ATT, and intention, INT, like those things are they're very different. And so your attention can direct your intentions and vice versa, what it is that you notice. And going back to that little prologue about Paul VanderKlay and attention, the thing that I was trying to get at here is that the notion that we need the right lights and just the right tone in our worship services, the difference there, it's so vast. If you travel around the world, the way people worship, I've been in places where when I left, my feeling was like, do I even know God? Like, it's so different the way that they worship. I don't even know if am I a Christian? Because I don't worship in the same way as this group over here, but there's something about the way this group over here is worshiping that leads me to believe they have a more fulgent, holistic view on God than I do. And so God comes along in the New Testament and says, hold on a second, a friend of mine, we were just talking about this a couple of days ago, so I want to be careful to cite him on this, but he asked me, he said, when Jesus was baptized and he comes up out of the water, what happens? And he says, the voice of God is heard by the people there. And what does the voice of God tell the people to do? Listen to him, listen to Jesus, listen to my son, and then do what he says. And so repeatedly throughout the New Testament, we come across this notion that, first of all, my job is not to be like, I can't change my stripes. I can't be more attractive than I am. I can't acquire more attention than just what I'm doing right now. I'm doing the best that I can. But it's not about that. Jesus says, don't worry about, if you just lift me up, my job is to draw all men to myself. Like, trust that God is who he is, and not our sort of faith in faith, or our faith in our ability to, if we have all the programs right or the music right, we could enter into his presence. This is a gift. For God so loved the world that he sent, he exchanged, no, he gave. And so to me, that this is how I sort of was thinking about this thread was, it isn't about the pastor. It isn't even about the level of your faith. It's about the object which our faith is put in. So focusing on Christ is the issue for me. I think that's what I was trying to get at is and when you think in a sort of information age or attentional economy, whatever you want to call what we're living in, when I say God puts the onus on himself to draw all men, that can be read as attention. Because you think back to Moses, this is a peculiar passage to me where the children of Israel, they're trying to it's almost like a developmental psychology. So I can see why Peterson is so interested in it, but, learning to train their attention on what Moses says to do, and Moses pointing up higher to this cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. It sort of trains them to sort of look at the staff, look what he's doing, look at what he's pointing at, watch what he's doing, and then understand that like this vertical communication that's going on between he and God then works itself out horizontally. because in the Tanakh, in the Old Covenant, you don't always have, the presence of the Lord isn't, I don't know a good word for it, but distributed widely in the way that Christians tend to think of it. You have throughout the Old Testament verses where it says like the Spirit of the Lord came upon so-and-so and they did X. Versus after the book of Acts, we have this sort of revision of what happens in Genesis 11, where there's a confounding of the language and people are sort of spread apart. But if you go back and read Genesis 11, it's interesting because God says they're all thinking the same thing. They're all speaking the same way. Their attention's all trained on the same thing. Sounds very similar to go to now, I will make myself like the Most High, as if this were something easy to do. So we'll just build a tower that reaches all the way to God. But God doesn't say, no, they won't. In the passage, God actually says, you know what? Because they're doing this, because they're all in one accord, nothing that they attempt will be withheld from them. So go to now, let us confound their language. And so we see in sort of Acts comes full circle where in the upper room, all of these different languages are being spoken and people passing by hear their own languages being spoken. So you see like a recovery of that sense in which this thing that was meant to divide people before, in the proper way, in the proper context, if you're training your attention on Christ, if you're training your attention on my Son, if you're listening to him, then we can reach people. This is a sort of reverse engineering of Genesis 11, but the way that it happens is, the Holy Spirit descends and he rests on all of those people simultaneously, which is, to my mind, I'm easily open to someone correcting me on this because I'm not a theologian, but in just reading passages, again, you have distinct individuals in the Jewish Testament that gives you this notion that God selects these individuals and works through their lives. And one of the beautiful things about, I think that for me as a Christian, is that this is for everyone, for all people. We can reach you in your language. We can reach you where you're at, and not by pointing to myself, but pointing to the person who claims to be the revelator himself, truth himself, not just reality, because even I equivocate oftentimes between truth and reality. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And in our theories of everything and in our scientific quests, we're always looking for what's ultimate reality. And Jesus says, you need to get to know ultimate truth, which is a person. It's me. You can have a relationship with me. And so there's no sort of barriers to that. It's widely distributed. It's decentralized, if you want to use sort of the language of today.
Well, one of the things that popped out at me as you're talking about Genesis 11 and then talking about the episode in Acts is that in one of my recent episodes, somebody made a comment. I had said something in the episode about ideologies being so toxic. And they made this comment. Well, what's the difference between an ideology and Christianity? Aren't they just the same thing? Isn't Christianity just another ideology? And so isn't it just as limiting? But when you talk about when they're getting ready to build the Tower of Babel, they're all thinking the same way. They're all saying the same thing. That's exact description of, especially the way Jordan Peterson talks about ideology, because the people are involved aren't even having their own thoughts. They're all thinking the same thing. So if you talk to one of them, they have the same babble that they come out with. There's no original thinking. It's just this empty all adhering to the same thing. But then in Acts, when the Spirit comes on all the individuals and they're each speaking a different language, I love the way that you relate that to, it's not just the verbalizing of words, but each one has a unique experience with the Holy Spirit and a unique way of lifting up Christ, so that all men will be drawn to him through all of the uniqueness of all this beautiful creation that he has made, rather than everybody saying the same thing. So I really like that picture.
Imagine reading the same poem over and over and over. Versus when Shaul gets converted, when he's, for us, the Apostle Paul, he comes along and he says, you are the workmanship of Christ. This is, this notion of a poema, that's powerful for anyone who studies language or communication. It's this thing, and there's a promise attached to it. It's that you're not just a poem. Yes, you're a poem in progress, but with a promise that I'm going to perfect it. I'm going to perfect it all the way down the line until you're with Christ himself. And look, far be it from me to try to paint a picture of Candyland or Pollyanna or whatever. I am not that guy. That has not been my path. And anytime, my antennas start to go up when people start making it sound too good to be true, because for God, his perspective on what perfecting me means looks entirely different from what my version of it is.
Yeah,
give me lots of money.
Let me just jump in here with something, because I think this is so vitally important. My husband and I have this conversation all the time, because my tendency, because I have been through a lot of painful things in my life, and some of those painful things I was willing to work through and let God work in me, and others of those painful things I sort of shut a door on.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a long time for me to come back to that and let God start working on me in that area. And so sometimes something will come up, and my first response is a spiritual response. Well, the scripture says thus and thus. And my husband is like, could you just be a human being? Could you just be real, right?
Yes.
And so there's this philosopher named Iris Murdoch. I don't know if you've ever run into her.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And so she made this comment that I thought was just startling, that art, when it fails because we seek to be too easily consoled. We don't want to face the darkness. We don't want to face the scary parts. So it's easier to console ourselves with something that makes it all shiny and pretty, and you come up with the right Bible verse for the right situation, because then you don't have to face the darkness. We seek to be too easily consoled. And I've really been living with that the last couple of weeks, because we've been through some tough things in our life group. A lot of tough things in the last couple of years, but in particular, just recently we lost a member of our life group to cancer after many, many years of praying. And there's this tendency to just want to shut that part out, because you got to go on with life. There's all these things happening. You got to take care of details. And yet seeking to be too easily consoled keeps us from seeing the deep, inner, beautiful truth of the work of art that God is creating, right?
Oh, Karen, yeah. Cutting me deep. Yes. Yes. So I think that concludes the preliminary portion of the conversation, and now we're getting into deep waters, as it were, because so first of all, what I want to say is there's a tendency I think, for people to, so there's two different categories of mistakes that we make. There's certainly more, but for the sake of time, two that you kind of alluded to is the, could call it like a script, like, you know, the Christian script, you hit it, bam, and then these words proceed, but they proceed as if there was no thought or sacrifice behind the utterance. And by that I just mean, so when someone close to Jesus died, what did Jesus himself do? And this is amazing. In the Greek, when it talks about him grumbling within himself, it's like a horse neighing and, you know, rearing and yelling out because it's so frustrated. So if you just think about a horse kicking, if you've ever been around an animal that is injured or does not want to be tamed, will not be tamed, that kind of fierce primal sound, that's what he was doing when Lazarus died. And you could get into a theology of divine foreknowledge and time and theory A and theory B of time and all of that. Fascinating conversations, but like, just to keep it existential for a minute, close to the bone, he wept. And it cost him something to love in this way. It cost him, I mean, we tend to think of it as like, throughout the ages, there's been this kind of flip-flop between seeing him as all God and no man, and then all man and no God. But the idea, the Pajot brothers helping us out with this, but like the heaven and earth coming together is this mediator. But I mean, in order to love, it means you will suffer. There's a famous Latin phrase, it translates something like, with love is full of honey and it's also full of venom. You know, this thing, you can't get away from it. And so to love means, in some sense, that there will be suffering involved. And now we could talk about the levels at which that is. So I think for me, the notion that, like, in talking with people, especially throughout the pandemic, when there's just so many people who have died, I mean, we just need to take a moment, step away from the kind of conversations that really distract us. Again, that attention, because your intentions will follow your attention. This is what worship is about. It's about orienting ourselves to the highest good and embodying that with our intentions and carrying that out to the best of the ability that we have with the grace of God. So I'm just saying, as someone in bioethics, I want to put the sort of biopolitical arguments to the side and just take a moment and say, for my own community, where I'm from, it was one of the hardest hit places in the United States. It's a very small place, so it's easy for the per capita number to sort of creep up, and small numbers can kind of distort. But as my youngest brother said to me one day, he was like, look, if there are only 10 people in the room, 3 or 4 of them die, like, you feel that very, very close. And so throughout the past couple of years, I've seen this response where it ranges from well, death is just Jesus taking your hand and guiding you home to be with him, and great, 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 great. The problem is you can get into these logical problems where you think, if the only purpose for my life is to just be in heaven as quickly as possible, then the ad absurdum argument would be then every baby should be killed upon birth, because you know the idea that this is a soul that's uncorrupted by this world, usher into the presence of God. But that doesn't make sense. We know that that's not, like, we can intuit that doesn't, it just doesn't make sense to think that way. And so I did have a very dear person say to me, well, death is just Jesus grabbing you by the hand and taking you. Okay, fine. Yes, it can be that. But not all of us are so lucky, because dying itself is a kind of ugly process if it's not, immediate. And then the after effects, even Christ himself suffered from that. So did the people around him. And they even antagonized him, said, hey, man, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. And the thing is, he didn't deny it. He said, you know what, that the greater works of the Lord would be revealed. This happened. But it even though he knew he had the power to raise him up, still the fact that this happened to someone that he loved, it is indescribably painful. So I don't want to speak Christianese to people. I want to say, you're a person, dadgummit. It should hurt. It should hurt. And it does feel, we get this sense that the world should stop when someone we love, something bad happens to them, or even us, especially if it's us. It's like, my God, why didn't the world stop today? Doesn't the world rotate around me? Am I not the center of the universe? But if you do think about loss, if you've lost someone close to you, it sort of gets beyond language, and there's just sort of feeling and perception that, how can it be that the world should continue? Because part of what it means for me to have a world has been cut off. That branch to my world has been cut off from me in this life. And so, I want to, as you're saying, like, not avoid that, but like take it in close to the chest and just hold and say, man, this is devastating. And I want to be with you in that and sit with you in that, rather than saying, well, no, is it perfectly right to also say, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord? Yes. I myself try very hard to practice that, even when something like that happens, even if it's through gritted teeth, because my toddler says to me the other day, I don't want to take a nap. I said, hey, that's great. I'm not asking you to want to take a nap. I'm asking you to take a nap. So it's fine if you don't want to. That's okay. Just take a nap. And I think that's sort of, as soon as I was saying it, was like, you eat that. You eat that. If you're serving it up to her, you eat it. Because I immediately realized my hypocrisy. Like, God, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be an interesting story. I don't want to have an interesting life, that may you live in interesting time. No, I want to be, and in fact, this is, in the medical world, someone like me, they call them a good book. You don't want to be a good book. You just want to be a generic schmo that there's no, amount of labs this big that follows you around. But I also want to be sure to affirm the fact that you can't have everyone else's suffering. Like you're the member of your group that passed, you know, you can bear their burden as a group, as an individual. You can come alongside them, weep with them, praise with them, joy with them, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, there's that second category mistake of thinking that, well, if I don't have that problem, then I don't have any problems. And I want to absolutely say that I don't agree with that, because the worst problem for you is the worst problem for you. That's just sort of the way that it is. And so whatever problem you're dealing with, that is your problem. And it's fine for it to be the absolute worst for you, because it is.
Well,
you can't.
I had an aha about that one time years ago. I was in a Sunday school that was in between the two worship services, and we used to, talk about our lives a little bit in the Sunday school class. And one woman came in one day and she was just shattered. She was completely broken. And it was because her cat had died. And my first impulse that rose up in me was, your cat, you're broken over. I mean, do you have any idea what real suffering is like? That's the talking in my head, that
Sure.
you grow up in a family where in my family, if my dad would say to my mom, "Hey, while you're up, could you get me a beer?" And my mom would say, "Who made you king?" So that's that voice, that's just immediate voice, like, right? That was my first thought. And then I backed off for a second and I thought, the pain that she's evincing right now is as great as any pain I have ever experienced. Whether that pain was the loss of a loved one or going through a divorce or any other tragedy that happened in my life, I can see, looking in her eyes, that she's experiencing a pain that's equal to that. All pain is individual, right? Now, some of it may be something we bring on ourselves, and that's probably true. You can make yourself go through, you can act in ways that cause you severe pain.
That's true.
Right? That's true. Other pain just comes at you. It's like falling into chaos, like Jordan Peterson talks about, right? But wherever that pain comes from, the experience of it is equivalent. It's, like, right?
Computational equivalence.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That was the first thought that came to me.
Yeah, right, exactly. Because as good as we might think we are at sort of running a simulation of another person, and I think that I haven't heard anyone else say this, but my wife and I tried to publish a piece on this years ago based on our experience working with different client populations. But the buzzword at the time was, it was all about cultural competence. And I thought, more deeply about that. And I think she actually came up with that. The concept was like cultural resonance. And it was sort of based on like actual physical resonance and like what it can do. If you've ever seen the famous images of probably millions of high school kids that take physics, see, a bridge swinging back and forth because of the way that works. I found that in practice, in therapy sessions, you hit this moment where if you get close enough, if you can sort of run that simulation of what that pain must be like for this person, not for every person, you're talking about the person in front of you. So putting aside like how I think I would react to the cat, it's this person in front of me, and what is it that I know about them, their unique disposition, and how can I best be with them in that moment? And what you see happening is like, these truly, it is called an installation of hope, even by someone as pragmatic as Irvin Yalom, whom, if your audience isn't aware of his work, it's just a tremendous psychiatrist who has his writing, even his textbooks are just brilliant. They're like, nah, you read it and you're like, installations of hope? Man, give me some of that. But these things do happen in the interaction. And so being like a Rogerian oriented therapist, when you're talking about holding someone in positive regard and looking for congruence, I felt like, as a Christian, that's just sort of like what we're called to do, right? Is not judge people, accept them where they're at, like, as best we can, to prize them or love them where they are and go with them there. Don't try to put a governor on it and say, no, you shouldn't feel this deeply about X. If it's a cat or cancer, the famous play, it's Everything I Learned, or Everything I Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Mm-hmm. There's that line in there that says, there's 3 different types of lumps, and you need to know the difference: the lump in an oatmeal, a lump in the throat, and a lump in the breast. So it's not to say that the thing in and of itself is the same, but the experiencing part is the part that's the same. And this thing goes all the way down to like even dreaming, because phenomenologically, you don't dream about X. We sort of utter that, oh, I had a dream about falling. But really, in your dream, you're falling. It's so phenomenologically, you have this sort of experience in a dream of falling. And then when you wake up and sort of like enter a different state of consciousness, you think back on it and say, oh, I dreamed about falling, or I dreamed about flying. But no, it was in your dream you were flying. And so I do think it would help people in the West to spend time with other cultures and groups and people that, even within the United States, even like, there's things happening that if we did some mixing and matching and send people, different places, almost like study abroad, you'd quickly learn that there's so much commonality. But then there are people who live closer to what I would call existence. They're up against existence. And what's peculiar about that is there really is an actual scientifically validated hardiness scale. Karen, it's so shocking that this should be true that I reached out to this really generous scholar to find out if there's any way this could feasibly be true. But Dr. Edward Schieffelin, he's retired now, but he spent decades living with the Bosavi. And he's commonly cited as saying that over the decades, he never witnessed what for our DSM would be considered a major depressive episode. And so I reached out to him. I was like, you've got to tell me about this. Like, it can't be real. And he said, well, I just, be sure that people understand what I'm saying is that by our standards, no, I didn't see that. He said, but let me give you a caveat here, that these people never experienced anything like a kind of Akkadian Pax Romana, nothing like that. They have lived close to the earth where it is very hard. There is lots of violence, brutality, and death. And yet, so I asked him, I was like, well, it seems like if you took us and put us in that position, these things seem like they would depress us. So what is that? And I would just say that one reason why the developing world was kind of, I just sort of guided in my own way, is my grandparents, they were so poor and lived so remotely that they didn't have electricity or running water. And so that's how my dad grew up. And my mom is from Fort Lauderdale, and so the first time she visited my dad's family, she's like, where am I? This is wild. You guys don't have electricity, no air conditioning, no running water, but like the hardiness there. And even that in and of itself is not always, it's not unconditionally a good, because you can develop something that could qualify as a disease of strength, where my own father, as robust as he is, that then became sort of plague for him, because he didn't notice things that other people might notice much earlier. So he's in the process of being treated for metastatic lung cancer right now, and never smoker, never drank, nothing like that. If he has a vice, it's just he loves to work, and he loves to work physically and hard. And so many of the symptoms that he was experiencing in his body, he just sort of said, nah, not a big deal, because I'm just going to go and do this work. And so going to these fancy institutions where the best doctors and best technology are, when the doctors would ask him, like, hey, what's your pain level at today? Like, it's about a 2. I would have to look at the doctors and I'd be like, that's your 10, a my 10, like his 2 and my, where there's just different worlds. Like he doesn't even process this world in the same way that I do. Which goes all the way back to your original lead-in about Dr. Huberman and how these small things can affect what it is we read out about our environment. And so whether it's anxiety, I used to be a college tennis player, and I will fully admit that when I was in a tough spot, when I was feeling nervous, I'd sort of pull back. And it always cost me. It would make me serve more tentatively. It was like I wasn't in a flow state anymore. I was in a sort of, state of retreat almost. And trying to impart some more wisdom to our family than what I was working with, I did look at, the highest performers are people, in specific domains, in athletics, is they just sort of interpret stress differently. They look at stress and pressure and interpret it as excitement. That feeling I'm feeling, that's excitement. That's not anxiety. That's not, the butterflies just mean I'm ready to play. I'm ready to go. And so that just sort of slight flip of the switch, I think it makes a huge difference. Even before this conversation, I was trying to say, oh man, I'm really nervous. And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm just excited. I'm excited to have this conversation.
That's so funny. People say they're nervous, and I'm like, to me, that's very strange, because it's just me. It's me and my little, Zoom thing on my computer. And why anybody would be nervous about that, I have absolutely no idea. But then it's your nerves and not my nerves. But I want to go back to this thing that you said about when you have those nerves, when you get ready to play, when you were a tennis player. And so you weren't in a flow state because of the fear, right? Right. And so to me, that goes all the way back to the garden, because I kind of have this temptation to believe that the reason that Eve trusted the serpent instead of trusting God was that she had some sort of fear that God wasn't for her, or that God wasn't going to meet her needs or give her enough, or that he was holding out on her. And the reason I think that fear has something to do with it is that I know that fear is what hinders us in creativity, because it's fear that causes all the procrastination. I'm not going to try this because maybe it won't be as good as it was last time, or I don't know how to do this. And therefore, so fear is like this great hindrance to creativity. And earlier you had talked about attention and intention. So somehow that's what breaks through the fear, is attending. So let's say fixing your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God the Father. We fix our eyes on him, and then that informs our intentions. So then we act out of that. But that's where the strength comes from, that fixing our eyes on him is somehow evincing our trust. So then we're not acting in fear. I mean, I don't know how to put it exactly, but somehow the picture came into my head when you said that, and then it sort of evaporated. But there was this other thing in the Huberman talk. I'm going to post a link to that because there's so many interesting things in there. And one of the things he was talking about with this glucose response is that we actually have these parallel tracks in our nervous system, where with glucose is just an example, but our visual cortex, they all have these parallel tracks. And one of them is kind of almost the same kind of a link as attention and intention, because one of the parallel tracks is the impact that the glucose has on us goes to a certain region, but then that will start up another track that is telling us, wait, you don't have enough of that thing. And so then it sets you looking for it again. So that the act of receiving is almost like generating a need. And so it made me, when I was listening to him talk, it made me think about the connection between beauty and meaning. So there's something in us that's seeking beauty, just in the same way that there's something in us that's seeking sweet things. We seek sweet things because our brains need glucose in order to function properly. But then when we get the glucose, it triggers a dopamine reaction, and that dopamine reaction actually generates a need for more glucose. Because the dopamine, the next time that you get your hit of glucose, it's a little slightly less amount of dopamine that you get, and you need more dopamine. So you're always going to keep going after that thing, right? So in the same way, I think we're seeking beauty, but in order for the beauty to turn into intention, there has to be some sort of meaning involved there. We can't just be taking it in all the time, because the taking in actually, maybe that's exactly why when you were talking about the Bosavi people who live in such need, I noticed that too. When I spent a month in Haiti one time, back when they were still under Baby Doc Duvalier, the dictator, just dire poverty everywhere you look, but they were so happy. I mean, to me, coming from America, here you are, you're living in a cardboard box, you don't have shoes. They would walk 10 miles through the mountains barefoot to get to church so that they could sing with great joy in their little thatched roof church building, right? It's staggering, because they're not just taking in beauty all the time. They're also having to act out of what gives them meaning in life. And what gives them meaning in life is helping each other get through this horrendous, chaotic world that they live in, the community and everything that they have to do that creates that meaning. So they take in the beauty, and then they act out of the intention of the meaning. And so there's some connection, there's some sort of I think there's some sort of parallel processing going in us that has to do with this seeking beauty and then receiving meaning, or generating meaning. I'm not quite sure how it works, but
no, I love that. I've never, because if you read, there's so many different wills to, a will to death, a will to this, a will to suffering, but the will to beauty, it's fantastic. But at the same time, there is anhedonia, where that dopamine blunting, the notion that, again, it's very similar to Lewis saying, going out into the woods, nature, whatever, experiencing God in this way, that, I can just keep repeating that. I can mechanize this process and just get to God. And this is one of the ways that the West has gone wrong, is our sort of mechanizing and isolating. That's what we love to do. We don't, and I wrote about this a while back, and I like, what we are looking for is, what is it about green tea that's so good? I don't mean taste. I just mean that people who consume lots of it tend to do better than those who don't. Why is that? Well, we started researching. There's all these beautiful compounds in them. So the scientific mind says, then let's isolate them. And then we can market it as, one of our pills equals 50,000. You'd have to drink 50,000 cups of green tea to get the value of one of our pills. But see, they sort of isolated that from a kind of practice oriented around slowly warming up the water, pouring it a certain way, and communing with other people. And so there's a proper context that goes along with it. Now, look, can you get most 80-20? Can you get most of the physiological benefit from just taking in the isolates from the green tea? Yeah, probably. But you might have lived a much better life if you had 50,000 cups of green tea with people that you love. But we're so fast paced, and we're just looking for those shortcuts in as many ways as we can find them, because we have, such a fear, I think, of aging, of dying, of experiencing what Ecclesiastes is just, there's a time for these things, and there's a great wheel that spins. And I'm sort of reminded of that at Easter, because my wife and I, we're considered like a sandwich generation, where we're having our families just starting at the same time as, say, like her father is 84. So she was the last of many children, and was not necessarily intended, it wasn't the expectation. And so she's the child of his old age. It's a beautiful thing, but it's also like, it's put us in an environment where, how you negotiate having a toddler, a baby on the way, and then all of these other family issues that go along with aging. I think it makes us, even me, sort of shy away from that aspect of life, like all the way back to the Murdoch quote. I mean, these things, it's true. When we resist, it makes us manic in a way. The denial of reality makes you manic. And, whether it's just saying, I accept this, I accept reality. I mean, what a powerful mantra that is. Just this notion of acceptance. That doesn't mean that we have to be passive, because Job accepted what came at the hands of God, but that didn't mean he didn't challenge him. And I do think that there's some of that in this, that we seek beauty, but because we like to isolate whatever the payoff is and amplify it beyond measure, we will take something beautiful like sex, and then we'll say, well, let's analyze it, which means, like cut it into pieces and find, well, where's the part that means the most to people in this? Is it the communing together, the sharing of space? The word conspirator is so beautiful because it just people who share bread. And so, no, how about a screen with images of people that you don't know engaging in an act you're not there participating in? Let's put critical distance between you and this very meaningful interaction, and just make pornography ubiquitous. That's the isolation and amplification that I'm talking about, because it is very good. It will hijack those same processes you're describing in the will to beauty, because we have it. And at the same time, we have anhedonia, which is a bowl of ice cream is good, it satiates, you get all the payoff from the biochemical process going on in your brain, your neurons firing, dopamine releasing, you feel good about that. But then we say, well, then if one is good, why isn't three better? And so we have 3 cups, and then it does dull your sense to which you can't get pleasure from 1 cup of ice cream anymore.
See, this right there, I think, is why, and this is my own particular stick, this right there is why I think evolution, the way that it is portrayed by people like Brett Weinstein or any of these scientists who always talk about evolution, that's right there why it can't possibly be true, because our system is actually created so that if you have the 1 bowl of ice cream, the glucose triggers the dopamine, which sets up this parallel thing that's going on in you that says, I want another bowl. And I'm going to suffer if I don't have another bowl. And so I have the next bowl, and then that sets up, and then I got to have the 3rd bowl. And the only thing that keeps us from just eating ourselves to death is that there has to be some sort of, we get trained in delayed gratification, or we have to learn something about denying ourselves. We have to be willing to experience some pain, the pain of separation, the denial of this need. That's not something that's naturally built into people. That's not built into us. No. All these other things are built into us to get what's, get what we got coming to us. And that's all built into us. But anyway, I'm going to leave that there. And I want to say one more thing before I lose the thread. And that is this whole thing of beauty. I've talked about this before, but a few years ago, I went to an art exhibit up in the city in San Francisco. It was beautiful. It was the work of the pre-Raphaelites, and it was called The Cult of Beauty. And there was some comment at the beginning of the show that there was some controversy when these artists were working, that there were some Christian thinkers who said, this is too much beauty. And of course, everybody's like, what are you talking about? You Christians are all a bunch of stick in the mud, that kind. Yeah. And so, but it stuck in my mind. So while I'm looking at this thing, it was so beautiful, and I'm very attracted to beautiful art, and the paintings are rapturously beautiful. The colors that they used and the images that they produced, and the work is just so sumptuous that the more and more of it that you take in, you can almost feel yourself becoming almost like sexually aroused from just the great beauty of it. Not that there was anything sexual in the work.
Sure.
Nothing. It's just these beautiful images of, let's say, Ophelia in the water with Hamlet standing by, or one of the knights in armor with some beautiful woman tapping his head so that he was being knighted or something. Beautiful images like this, beautiful clothing, beautiful skin, beautiful hair. And you just take in more and more of it. And there's this excess of beauty coming into you and I started feeling very uncomfortable towards the end of this thing. And I'm starting feeling like, should I even be here? Is this appropriate for me as a believer to be so overtaken by beauty? And then I contrast that with the icons, because the icons are so very almost severe in their rule-oriented nature. They have to be done a certain way, and they're representing a very flat surface. And I think partly that's done so that it doesn't, they're beautiful, but they're beautiful in a very restrained way that doesn't generate that same sense of satiety. And yet, when you look at the icon, you're looking through that and primarily looking through it to deep truth and looking through it to the reality of suffering and the depth of suffering that Christ went through in order to be able to say it is accomplished, right? So you see this beauty versus suffering in these two kinds of art. And that really struck me when you were talking about the denial of reality and the acceptance of reality. And I want to put this out there for people too. There's this wonderful video with Jonathan Peugeot and Tammy Peterson talking about the crucifixion. And that's one of the things that they specifically talk about is our need to accept reality and what kind of sacrifice is required in that. So yeah, it was very, very good. I want to make myself a note to put that link in there.
And if people see me looking down, that's exactly what I'm doing, is I'm feverishly writing here on my pad, all these
I'm
things.
always taking notes and I'm always looking down, and I think people notice, but then they're listening to you. So, well,
so just, by way of background, so that people, when I say what I'm about to say, the inclination might be to sort of have a portrait of me that isn't it isn't sort of as round as it should be for the character. Now,
just say it.
Where I came from, like, there's the art that you would see is just the stars. I mean, it's so hard to communicate to people in an interconnected world what it is like to be in a place that is deeply isolated to the outside world. But the people that you are connected to, there's such an intimacy and a familiarity and a sort of joy in being in communion with them, that it has payoffs of its own. But so that my father didn't allow us to go too many steps away from his life, we kept livestock, we raised pigs, and for those who have not done this, but if you're mucking around with pigs in the morning before you go to school, there's just no amount of bathing that you can do. If a pig really wants to get after you and gets you and gets mud and muck all over you, you can take all the baths you want. It's not coming off. And one of the terrible nicknames that my brother got, which he's getting the last laugh now, they called him Pig Boy Cradshaw. It was just a terrible nickname because he was taking care of so much livestock. I mean, it was, so to go from that to like what you're talking about is I was at Columbia. One of my friends, he was He lived just a little ways down from me when we were studying at Oxford. We were great friends. When he comes back to the States, goes on a mission trip, comes back. In fact, he was in Indonesia right before the terrible tsunami. And the only reason he got out was because another one of our best friends was getting married. And so he came back to the States for that. And then like his whole world there had been devastated. And so he kind of was looking, what do I do now? And so he entered grad school at Columbia. And one of the things that he did, and it's so foreign to me, was he was the lead choreographer for this, I don't know what to call it because it wasn't quite ballet, but it was definitely dance and movement. It was a, modern performative art using one's body. And that was actually like his thesis. And again, I'm prefacing it to just say that he wanted me to come see their practice before their first show. And I was sitting there and I was watching it. And just as you said, for me, it wasn't necessarily arousal. I had this overwhelming feeling of like, should I be seeing this? Seems very intimate what's happening on stage. And so after it was over,
maybe that's a better description of the feeling.
They said to me,
I think that's a better description of the feeling.
They said, okay, what did you think? And so I told my friend, I was like, dude, you know who I am, you know where I came from. So I'm just going to tell you from my perspective, I felt very ambivalent, a little bit like a voyeur, like, should I be seeing this? Not because I thought it was like lurid or anything like that, florid. And I wasn't trying to be prurient. I just said like, whoa, this seems like walking into a stranger's house and listening to them have an argument for which I have no business participating in. It felt that intimate. And they were like, great, then we've accomplished what it is. We wanted you to feel a little bit uncomfortable because the intimacy, we're trying to draw you in, but yet you're like so close, which is, this is a cinematic technique is, you, as a person, as a close-up happens, it like, the attention is drawing you in. And there's a point at which it's like, it's so close that it makes you uncomfortable, which is why doing this makes me uncomfortable because I don't want to see myself on a screen. But on the other hand, the will to beauty and anhedonia, like you can say like our need for this is like our need for glucose and ketones and oxidating fat and all of that. It's just as important nourishing us because imagine you have an ideal body and brain, but nothing to do with it. No pursuit that's higher than you. That's not going to work. It will not get you through when you inevitably experience whatever existential crisis is facing you in the future. And just a plug for those people who haven't yet discovered Wolfram. This is my addition to that conversation is that the experiment that you are, the black swan that Taleb talks about, we should think of it differently. Existence is the black swan. That you and I should be sitting here at all is truly unbelievably miraculous. That when you talk about computational irreducibility, that an egg cell, one cell, fast forwarded through time, would be sitting here with all of these digital devices about as far away in the United States as could be possible, having a conversation like this. It's just so overwhelming. But the part that to me is pertinent is that you can't know it from the beginning. It actually has to play itself out. So when you look at Wolfram's Rule 30, you can't know in advance that it's going to from those simple rules, come up to something like a randomness generator. You actually have to let it move through its process and see where it ends up. And the same thing is true of a life. At our conception, it's unwritten. And even if you were to, now with the ubiquity of cell phones and cameras everywhere, I have recorded so many videos of our baby doing things that I told my wife, at some point, the map and the territory they're getting close to the same thing, because in order to watch all the footage almost amounts to rewatching her whole life. And this unfolding process, it has to happen. Jesus in the garden, hey, is it possible that this cup pass from me? Because I really don't want to do this. If it's possible to do it, no, man, we got to play this thing all the way out. It has to be played out all the way. Just because we know the end result isn't enough. There's some sense in which it has to be experienced. God himself has to experience the denial of himself. What? God has, in Chesterton's kind of language, for a moment, God becomes an atheist? That's insane. He denies himself. What does that even mean? That's a mystery that you could spend the rest of your life and many other lives trying to get to the bottom of. But it was embodied and it was experienced. It wasn't just Gnostic. And when we seek beauty, yes, there's a danger that we will go too far and experience anhedonia and blunt that experience and what it can do for us, rapture that it can afford us. But think about Sehnsucht, and this word it just doesn't have enough purchase on us. But Sehnsucht is what Lewis said, that's that ache that hit him from the time he was a child, that every time he'd go through life and intimations of the divine, the numinous would come after him, he'd feel that ache. It's that moment of I'm experiencing beauty, but it's not enough. I'm looking at the painting, I'm appreciating it, I'm studying the history of it. I know everything about the artist. I could tell you where Vermeer's from. Delft is a beautiful. That isn't the same thing as wanting to experience it and enter into it. And so even this is the part that people are missing about worship and our attention being drawn to God. First of all, you don't do it yourself. You can't just decide, I'm going to have an ecstatic experience with God, or I'm going to experience the numinous, the divine other, the holiness in Otto's words. What does that mean? You can't even draw yourself to do that. This is how impoverished we are. But it shouldn't, I don't think that diminishes the beauty of who we are as human beings. You could read it that way. But the example I used in that thread with Paul was, think of it like this. Okay, we say to ourselves, I'm going to have this awesome church service. I'm going to have the best worship team, and we're going to have communion. We're going to Eucharist, all of it. And our attention is going to be drawn to the Lord, and we're going to experience his presence. There have been so many services where I went to that were just flatter than flat, flatter than a pancake. Jesus said, there are certain places he was like, because of your doubt, I couldn't do it. I couldn't even do miracles, and I'm God. What does that say? Like, your expectations for me were so low, I couldn't even do it. And people don't realize what a slight it is that he would say to his own people that their captor, the centurion over here, has greater faith than you. You want to see how to worship God? Be more like this guy who said, Lord, hey, I'm a man of authority. I serve under authority. I get it. You're a man of authority. You don't even have to come to my house. Just say the word only. My daughter's healed. All you got to do is say the word. Jesus is like, look at this. Now that's faith. Come on. So we can have the expectation that there's going to be, whatever you want to call it, a revival, a re-enchantment, but there's no guarantee that that will happen. Why? Because you're not in charge of that. And you're also not in charge of, no man comes unto the Father unless the Spirit first draws him. Like, God has a role to play in this. And I like to say, like, this is a scenario that hasn't happened, but I'm sure at some point it will. That imagine my toddler, me trying to explain to her what Mother's Day is. Okay, it's a day to honor the life of the person who gave you life. We want to do something special for her. So let's go try to find something that might symbolize that, whether it's you making art or going to a store and getting something. And we go and something draws her attention, because another one of the points that I made is like, it's just, we know this intuitively. There are probably many people in your life that you met that you could have liked if you only had liked, and maybe they were richer, maybe they were better looking, maybe they were funnier than the person that you actually chose, but for some reason you didn't like them. They did not attract you. That thing leaps out and grabs something in the world. It's second order consciousness becoming first order consciousness. You can discipline yourself to do certain things, but I can't make myself love someone I don't. I can commit to someone, and by the act of committing, I can grow in love for them. But I'm talking about attraction here. Like, okay, there's plenty of people that we didn't click. What is that? What's that? Je ne sais quoi. What's this thing? It just didn't happen for us. So you can't even make yourself like someone who might have been more suitable to you because of your own disposition. So how are you to think you will love God on your own by using psychotechnologies? I say, this is me taking my daughter to the store and saying, here's your array of options. You can pick something that you think will mean a lot to mama. She picks an object, we take it. And as I'm also teaching her how to live in the world, I say, okay, now you give her this money and then they will give you the object and we'll go home and we'll wrap it up. But notice what happened is, first of all, she has no concept of the calendar or holidays or what Mother's Day is. So I have to inculcate her into that first. I am teaching her that. Then I'm saying, one of the things that we might do is honor her. Maybe we'll make her something together that'll be meaningful. But then maybe we'll get her something that just an act of service. Maybe that's not her love language. Maybe we'll get her something that she will really like. That's important to know, that a person experiencing what it means to feel loved isn't my definition of that. If your version of feeling really understood, loved, appreciated, attended to is to be taken to see pre-Raphaelite art, and I take you to a pencil making factory, you might get something out of it, but you might think, do you really know me? Do you really understand me? So I have to sort of, put some guide rails up for our daughter and say, we can't just pick any old thing. It needs to be something that's meaningful as a symbol. And so she picks the object, and I give her the money to pay for it with. And she pays for it. We take it home, we wrap it up, and she gives it to her mother as if it were hers, as if she had done it all. And the beauty of this interaction is that my wife treats it as such. Of course, she knows, my daughter knows when Mother's Day was, and like all of those things are background noise, but the act of loving, meaning giving at times, that's sort of the game of games that we're playing, is orienting yourself to the other in a way that Buber, might call an I thou, but that's maximally meaningful, an authentic meeting, as it is in literature, between these two people. That's what I'm trying to have with you. Like when my wife and I prayed before you and I taught, she was like, help them to have a great conversation, just like that might help them both in their own lives as new ideas emerge in their conversation, but not like a good one, but a great one. And maybe we will, maybe we won't, but that's my goal. And this moment of realization where somehow, though she doesn't quite understand all of those rules yet, my daughter sees her mother embrace this gift as if it's the greatest gift that could have ever been given, and that it was all done by her. This is the way that I think of it. I mean, I think we're so impoverished that we start to fool ourselves into thinking that, because what you could say is, well, aren't we at a point now as a people, as a religion, where we're kind of past the point of which we need a loan from God to love him with? And I say, absolutely not. If you think you are, then man, we need to have a much longer conversation. You need to show me your search history. You need to show me what you're spending your money on, things of that nature. Like how are you actually demonstrating to God what your rational worship is? Where's your attention? And so you could make a compelling argument that, well, one day your daughter will grow up, and let's say she's 18 and she decides to honor her mother. Unbeknownst to you, you didn't prompt her. She just went out and she did something special for her in her own way and honored her. So the training wheels aren't there anymore. You're not doing any of the activities that you mentioned before. And I would still say, what? Okay, so history started at that moment? That's when you're going to start and say, this is when it was real. This is when it happened for the first time, because she did it at 18 unprompted. What about all the energy that her father poured into teaching her how to do it, orienting her so that it's even a possibility, what William James calls a live possibility? Not everywhere in the world do they have a Mother's Day. This is a very discreet thing relative to the culture that we find ourselves in. They have other celebrations that we don't have. So I'm just saying, all of that stuff that as a father I would have put into it, you can't just arbitrarily say at some point, well, now what the father did doesn't matter. The daughter can do it all her own. And this is what I think sort of the turn towards that you can just get there repeatedly through these same means and mechanisms. And how I think that relates to Sehnsucht is, have you ever been in a service or private prayer time where you were experiencing the presence of the Lord or the divine or the numinous, however people want to describe it, that was so incredibly gripping that it almost felt as it, like when it ended, it's almost the sense of like not being able to consummate the thing, which is why I don't think your use of arousal is a I think it's a perfectly beautiful metaphor for this, because there's some sense in which the act, because you can't get beyond here and now, although that's what it is you're desiring. I mean, I've been in moments with the Lord where it felt like, man, God, either you need to take me right now or you need to return, or something needs to happen, because I can't stay in this state. I mean,
that's exactly right. That's that feeling. It's about this anytime you try to use words to nail it down, it's going to diminish it, but it is very close to that feeling of, I need this to be consummated. It's so all consuming, all powerful, this being filled to the extent that there's just no more room for filling. Just pouring in, that it may be the only way that you can get past that is to start pouring out, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why worship calls us into service, because you get that filling, then it has to pour out someplace. And so in the old song that actually was playing when that started to awaken my spirit and drew me to Christ was one of the lines was, I can't live on a mountain, so you picked out a valley for me. Because that mountaintop experience is so powerful, but we can't live there. We can't function there. It's too much, right? So the valleys, you can think of a valley as this lovely place with the pasture and the grass and the river running through it and all of that. But the valley is also that place where you fall down into, but when you between the two mountaintops. So like that, we're called from glory to glory, but the getting from one mountaintop to another mountaintop requires going through a valley. And that's where the suffering and the sacrifice and all those things take place. Listen, you and I could talk for a week, but we probably have to stop now because we've been going for over an hour and a half. And
oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. So can we talk again? Because I would really enjoy talking again. And
absolutely.
I really think maybe because you and I have a very different maybe energy or something than talking to Paul, maybe it would be a wonderful thing for you to tell some of your story.
Okay.
So people would understand, because you have developed this deep wisdom that comes out of a life of pain and suffering and acceptance of reality. And it would be a good thing for people to hear some of that, I think. And next time I would also like you to talk about what it is that you do.
Okay.
It sounds like your work is utterly fascinating. And I'm assuming that your work arose out of your experience.
Yeah. I mean, you could definitely say that, to try to make sense of the world that I lived in and the potential that it might have for others. Just the things that are emerging and what that might mean for other people, and sort of the promises and perils of that. And yeah, it's a landscape that Christians are sort of late, to my mind, of getting around to and engaging in, but there are more and more people sort of engaging in these issues. So yeah, I would be happy to do that. It would be a huge honor, because it's one of the only reasons that I'm here. I told my wife it's there's not to be able to talk about those things for me is to be like indefinitely pregnant. I mean, at some point you have to either give birth or what's this been about? So sure. I mean, that being able to help other people, that was the dream that sort of kept me alive. That was my why, that Viktor Frankl talks about, that could get you through something as atrocious as a concentration camp.
Well, let's get together again soon. And
let's do it. I enjoyed it.
Part of the reason, and this is a selfish acknowledgement of my own weaknesses, but part of the reason that I wasn't prepared to do that today is that there's times when it's just too hard to take in the pain, someone else's pain, right? Yeah. But I do want to hear your story. I've read your story, but it's an entirely different thing to actually be able to talk to somebody and try to understand it at another level. So,
and my affect doesn't always, I have a well-established inappropriate affect, because if you've lived like that, then not to be in a hospital is a good day. Like that's sort of my set point. So I think people are usually surprised if I'm not looking differently than I do. Let's just say it like that.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, I think when you've been through a lot of pain and you've come out the other side, it's sort of as though you're in a completely new space. And so
different. Yeah.
So it's like trying to put yourself back there. Sometimes when I tell my story, I'm sure that people look at my affect and think, well, she just doesn't have any emotions at all. Well, no, that was another me, sort of. It's like your toddler. You've got all these pictures, which is great, because the day will come when that's not her anymore. She's another person, and you're going to have the grief of saying goodbye to that little person that she was.
It breaks my heart. Yeah. Every morning is like waking up to Christmas. I, rush in to see what she looks like, because she changes so fast.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, they start to lose the baby fat and all of that. And I'm like, where are her cheeks going?
Yes, exactly. So anyway, like I said, we could go on for weeks. So I will get in touch with you and we'll figure out another day. And in the meantime, if you have any links that you want me to put in the description section, drop me an email. Okay.
Karen, thank you so much.
Yes.
It's been awesome.
Thank you so much. It was a real privilege to hear your thinking, and thank your wife for praying for us, and give her my best.
I will.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks.